Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a question and answer session on obsolescence case management brought to you by AMSYS and SiliconExpert. I'm George Corralius, and I'll be your moderator today. You can participate in today's Q&A session by asking questions at any time during this webinar. Just type your question into the Q&A text area located to the right of the presentation window, and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. At the end of the webinar, we will ask you to complete our feedback form. Your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future webinars and events. You can also launch the survey at any time by clicking on the red survey button at the bottom of the console. If you are experiencing any technical problems, please type your issue into the Q&A text area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. So today's session is a continuation of our webinar demonstrating the advantages of using AMSYS and SiliconExpert to mitigate your obsolescence risk. You can access this webinar by going to the Knowledge Center page of the SiliconExpert website. This previous webinar, which demos AMSYS and SiliconExpert, is called the Introduction to Proactive Obsolescence Case Management. The link is also available in the Resource tab of this webinar. So to answer your questions today, we have Bjoern Bartels, Managing Director at AMSYS. Bjoern has worked in the field of consultancy by supporting his global customers with obsolescence management, core competencies and tactics for many years. And we have Oliver Hoffmann, EMEA Director at SiliconExpert. Oliver's passion is sharing knowledge and insights into solving problems by applying data-driven decision-making. Bjoern and Oliver have worked together for many years, bound by their desire to mitigate obsolescence risk for companies all over the world. And now let's get into our Q&A session on obsolescence case management. Bjoern, Oliver, glad to have you here. Why don't we start off with this first question? So besides parts going obsolete, a challenge is now the availability of active parts. Are there strategies that can work for both?
Oliver, I hope it's okay if I just start off here, actually. And it's a pretty nice question, actually, that was sent in beforehand. And it's a nice question because typically, if I look at current standards, the definition of a part being obsolete is when it's no longer in production by the original manufacturer to original specification. What usually does not apply if we talk about availability. But looking more to the US market, we have the so-called term DMSMS, where DMS, basically diminishing manufacturing sources, stands for the obsolescence part in DMSMS, and MS does stand for material shortages. So there must be some kind of combination in there. So although what I think by the standard, availability is not an obsolescence issue, I think that in a maybe de facto obsolescence case, same processes and methods might apply. How do you think about it?
I would even copy that and point out which pieces of data or data points would, let's say, indicate that we are now in something that means component is unavailable. I cannot produce my products. And if it is now missing on the production site of the original manufacturer, or if the distribution channel is dried out because of a too high demand, I think the combinations that are monitorable over time would be increase or decrease of stock over time and its trending. And in case of demand increasing too much, just as an event that begins towards an allocation, that's when stock goes down, price and lead time would go up. That's also an event that happens for a component that is still in demand but going obsolete. So at the end of the day, the indicators of stock going down, price and lead time going up might be an indicator. If it is a single component within a category, I dare to call that this being the ambassador of obsolescence coming based on data points. And if it happens to a certain concerning amount of components within a category, that's an indicator for an allocation. There are more parameters when we try to identify allocations later. But at the end of the day, yes, a bottleneck is a problem. You can't produce if component is not available. And data-wise, the indicators seem differently, but when it comes to handling such a case through a process on your internal world, trying to make sure that you do not forget any of the impacts, I think that's when more the process side is in question than just the data side for discovery. So I would suppose identify the problem based on data from the outside world and then hand over to the obsolescence case management as these procedures might apply.
Oliver, I totally agree with that because even as I said, if, to be honest, allocation or availability of parts is typically not an obsolescence issue or hard obsolescence issue. I mean, in our AMSYS lifecycle management cloud that handle cases and does the risk analysis, we use a lot of SiliconExpert data. So I see that from two sides. And from the first view, I totally agree with you because usually the clients that we see and that we consult, they are asking the same questions when it comes to availability issues as they would ask themselves in obsolescence issues, like where's the part built in, who's responsible, how much stock do I still have, what's the demand actually, how big is the issue I have once it comes to case management. Plus, and I'm sure we'll talk about risk analysis and proactive obsolescence management later, as you said, there's different data sets you need to integrate into your overall risk analysis, where in obsolescence management you usually have the technology forecast, and you already brought the points, what you need as types of data sets to do a full-scale risk analysis. So to make the same strategies work for component shortages in the same way as the item would actually be hard obsolete.
Yeah, and I think this also goes towards a problem which I call the ROM-POM problem, like reactive obsolescence management as ROM, proactive obsolescence management as POM or POM. Like we have to react, like we have to go through the ROM process now, and it typically begins with, I wish I would have been proactive before. But you can only have been proactive if you actually did it. And conducting such a process thoroughly is to follow a process. So data is just the input. The process is to, let's say, consistently do what's necessary. Have defined which internal research activities need to be done. Which are the affected products? Which are affected distributors? Yeah. Is there a timeline? What about the lead time changes? And so on. And when it comes AMSYS and SiliconExpert, I see SiliconExpert maybe as the source of data as a service. If used early, you can do POM, proactive obsolescence management. And if you don't do this, you have to do reactive obsolescence management afterwards. But both are things or processes that are mapped out in the workflow engine of the AMSYS clients, I suppose. Bjoern, you've seen this more frequently.
I mean, exactly. I mean, we have been working together for so many years already, and the cooperation between our two companies, between SiliconExpert and AMSYS, is growing and growing. And I really think, and if we sum up the question, if there are strategies for both availability of items and obsolescence, I would just sum up and would say, okay, if you are really stable in reactive case management and proactive obsolescence management, you need different data sets to aggregate and to take into account. But however, you can use the same processes and methods that you usually use in an overall scope of obsolescence management also for allocation or availability problems to solve the issue, because it is a de facto obsolescence, because your company can't work with that. So for you, it is as the part would be obsolete already, because you cannot wait for 50 weeks or longer to go back to production or to finally maintain your system if you're an operator.
I think we would like to continue responding to this first question, but this was about components being obsolete or being unavailable, and like condensing answers would be, the answer is POM. You better do proactive obsolescence management with data and process. It can help you with both. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with that. So George, do you
right.
have other questions? I hope we answered the question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so let's move on. Actually, I'm going to combine these next two questions. So how does a team proactively manage obsolescence, and explain the management of obsolescence as the best means to not lose money?
Show the money. Show the management of the money. But maybe we should start off, what does proactive obsolescence management mean? Again, as I've worked in the maintenance group of the latest IEC 62402 revision, what usually needs to be done when it comes to proactive obsolescence management, first of all, what you actually need, you need a good configuration of your overall system. That's a must. If you don't have it, you should stop right away. And we have seen so many companies struggling with good data, internal data, and so on. Another thing that you usually need and make proactive obsolescence management work is that you need resources. Resources meaning you need people doing it, because this is not something to be done in 5 minutes in your daily routine. You need tools to properly manage it. So in the end, you need some budget, and this kind of then later on refers to the other question. And then proactive obsolescence management means that you have to combine the likelihood of each and every item in your system that you want to manage proactively with the possible impact that this item becoming obsolete or having way too long lead times, or what will be the impact of your overall system on your company, and so on. And in this combination, combining, and this is actually what we are doing from AMSYS and our client, where we combine the SiliconExpert data, because you all know the forecast are pretty great that you get out of SiliconExpert, and you can determine likelihood out of that, plus lead times and even prices and so on, how they evolved over time. But usually all goes on the likelihood side of an overall risk analysis, and then combine it with internal data, like in answering questions like, how important is this specific item to my overall design? What is my yearly, quarterly demand? How much stock do I still have on hand? To then, in this combination, determine overall risk. Problems that we usually see here is with the constant and regular updates, not from SiliconExpert and with the data set, but more from the internal types of data that you need to take into account as well to do a full-scale risk analysis. And as the question was, like, how do teams usually manage obsolescence proactively? It is a team effort, because you need data out of different departments from your company, be it engineering, purchasing, maybe even quality, product management, if it comes to demand questions and stuff. So what we feel, although we can automate proactive obsolescence management approaches plus the case management. In the end, it is a software, and software still needs to be triggered by individuals. And in the end, it has to be a team effort as an overall approach within the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's a big thing that happens with so many people in one company. It's just the question for the size of the company. If it's a big corporation or a small to medium enterprise, a small to medium business, it's a team basically means we have to be honest to ourselves and identify that there are different roles necessary. People that have the role of, I have the expertise to be able to select components because I understand the technical requirements. Other roles might be, I have a little bit of more of a bird's eye view. I try to understand the risk implications. Others understanding, like, we actually have to buy these things. I have the understanding of operational or operative procurement. Like, where does which component come from? How is price evolving? Where do I renegotiate? And so on. There are so many different disciplines and people involved, whereas the smaller the company, true, one person may have several of these roles, but all of this costs time. It has the intention to hopefully repeat each of these activities so for a certain amount of times. For example, we don't want to have a redesign project for each of our products every year. Every couple of years would probably be good enough. And the more rare our redesign projects would be, the less money we have to spend. This goes towards that part of the question where it was, how do we not lose money thanks to obsolescence management? And I think if we consider the selection of a component being a data-driven decision, we have to acknowledge that the decision itself causes a certain time to collect the most recent knowledge or data, and then make that decision and apply it in probably a new design of the product. But each of those component selections comes with a little bit of story when it comes to cost. Because at the end of the day, when we decide for a new component, someone has shipped this to us. Transportation has been paid for, insurances, services, warehouses, or whatever. Like, we even had to process a certain supplier, maybe even with an evaluation. We have our own value-adding activities. We host our own technical infrastructure just to conduct this process. And depending on how the cost of a process has been calculated into the cost of a redesign project, that allows us to really calculate the amount of money that is savable due to obsolescence management. Just because a company might not be aware of measuring a certain process on average by its cost does not mean that the cost does not occur. The money is floating, and we just how much of the money we spend is allocated to transport or to our own infrastructure or in time or in liabilities, where this is money taken out of previous year's profit and cash flows.
Yeah, especially
in short, companies know how to calculate their own return on invest and break even, and we can help to feed the data in a way that it maps to each company's return on invest preferred calculation stats.
Yeah, exactly. To actually just grab that point that you lastly made, I like to compare usually, especially proactive obsolescence management, with a kind of insurance. Even in private life, I think everyone is sometimes thinking about, hey, do I need this extra insurance for something that might eventually happen? Because and it depends on different variables. Like maybe I don't need an insurance if I would be a millionaire and have enough money on hand or whatsoever to find a solution to my problem. In that instance, that problem occurs. And same applies to obsolescence management. It goes down to the money. And if I'm afraid of losing money, and especially if I'm even contractors of supporting producing system for 20 or 30 years, and have huge obligation to do so, I don't want to fall short. So this is actually how the best way to explain to management to really secure the capabilities of being still able to produce or maintain a system in 20, 30 years especially not to lose money. And there was a funny question. There was another question that was sent in advance that I just remember now. There was a question: how can we transform to proactive obsolescence management? We are already now covered completely with reactive cases. And that's exactly it, because once you're in a state where you are able of combining this external, internal data, really do a proper risk analysis, being up to date each and every day and so on, you can actually plan resources and dedicate resources, not wasting money, but really dedicating resources, and especially engineering resources, to find proper solution and not find solutions on each and every piece part level. Hey, I'm going to stock up here a little. I'm going to choose for an alternative part here. I will not do anything here, and so on, because this is covering a lot of workload. And I mean, there are studies and stuff out there, like how you can possibly actually come to the point where you can strategically optimize your redesign planning and then dedicate resources on a specific point in time to solve a lot of obsolescence issues with only one engineering effort. And I really think this is how to explain management, that not only proactive obsolescence management is a kind of insurance, but it will also save you money in the end, because you can dedicate resources even better once you have all the data and you are in control, and you're not controlled by others, your manufacturers, your suppliers anymore.
Yeah. That's great. Do you want to jump to Mike's question now? Do you want to jump to this question?
Just one more comment.
Sure thing. Sure
Sorry,
thing.
George.
Go ahead, Oliver. No, that's okay.
Because Bjoern just discovered something nice, like the idea of insurance in the context of obsolescence. The question was about how can we protect ourselves with obsolescence management from losing money. I admit I haven't Googled in the last couple of weeks, but every now and then I look for, is there an insurance against obsolescence? And so far I haven't discovered one yet. But I'm comparing this as, if I were an insurance company, how much money would I choose if I had to insure my clients against the impacts of obsolescence? And I think it's a pretty nice budget if I assume that my clients had an annual turnover of $100 million in sales or so. How much of that, percentage-wise, would I need as an annual insurance fee to make sure I can protect and compensate my customers against the impacts of obsolescence? Whereas the cost of setting up a proper process and getting the data streamed into this is probably just peanuts. Data-wise, I know it's normally not more than 0.2% of the annual spend of a company for electronics when it comes to the data side. For process, I don't know yet, but at least raising the topic of insurance made me think, and I'm going to run my Google search for this later on, Bjoern. So thanks for reminding.
All right, thank you for that. All right, so let's jump to this question. Do you supply up-to-date lead times of parts from suppliers?
So that's something only Oliver can answer.
That's an Oliver question. Yes, we show lead times. The lead times are not from right now. They are from this week, or typically when there are certain date stamps visible. That means at that point in time, for example, like from last week, we aggregate the lead times out of all these franchise distributors that report lead time and prices in stock to SiliconExpert. So when SiliconExpert says the minimum and the average lead time on February 1st was like 10 weeks to 20 weeks, then this is a calculation represented by all the data shared to SiliconExpert from the 74 different franchise distributors over the last 30 days. So it's an aggregated, compounded view out of more than 70 different franchise distributors over the last 30 days, pinned on a certain point in time when we ran the calculations. But
Great.
it's the question. It's the lead times from the distribution, not the lead times as announced by the manufacturers.
Understood. Okay. All right. So we have another question from the audience here. Do you have a business case or example of a company that used proactive obsolescence management to refresh its product offering or strategy and increase profitability? Have we seen that recently? I'm sure, you have some examples in that. In general sense.
Not only recently, not only recently. I mean, there's a lot of business cases, and I mean, if all of you who are attending today's live Q&A session, you just get in touch with SiliconExpert and AMSYS and afterwards, and I'm sure we can showcase even more use cases. I mean, if it comes to cases, actually, there's one big case actually that we were able to publish, is especially from process consultancy and automating processes. So what usually happens is if you compare how you're doing obsolescence management today, if you're in the early start, and try to figure out where you're actually wasting money in terms of processes, because what usually happens if you have a problem and it drops in your company and you give it to different individuals that don't know the other individual exists. So basically they're in different rooms, and you give them the same task, and maybe based on a same set of data, they will come to different solutions. So what we have seen in the past is, although there was one problem, there was different departments coming up with different solutions. And the one department decided for the same product was the life of need buy stocking solution. The other department came up with the redesign, and the third department decided not to do anything, and so on, what is basically a waste of resources. So there's a lot of business cases. So for example, in one of our consulting projects, we were able in comparison to what was done before, to save more than $3 million within only 7 months. So that was one of the really big business cases we came in. And yes, especially in these certain times, we also do see business cases where the end products, because they cannot be supported anymore with the existing resources, are then also maybe not even refreshed, but they are becoming obsoleted, the end products, because there's also so many obsolete items in them, and so on. For a good strategy for refreshing products, you actually need the proactive approach to obsolescence management, because you need the data, you need the forecasts on the item levels, you need pricing information, you need information of internal data, like, hey, okay, what's the expected demand of my end product? Do I have service level agreements signed? Is it still worthwhile on doing what I'm doing here? And then with this all in a combination, actually, in the magic box in the middle, companies are then finally capable of really doing good design refresh optimization to, in the end, then produce their own products or maintain their own products way cheaper than with all the obsolete items still in there. This is what we have experienced. I'm sure, Oliver, you have some other cases as well on this instance.
Yeah, like it's not ultimately connected to the proactive side of obsolescence management as well, but more obsolescence management in general. But if we understand the selection of a component as a data-driven decision, it's more, we first try to find a technically, hopefully equivalent component, and then we wonder, is it maybe financially more affordable? And that comes with this little benefit of SiliconExpert knowing billions of alternative components relationships. So trying to find a full fit function alternative. If it is out there in the world market, you can filter by, is this active in production? Is this reach unaffected, ROHS compliant, and on stock at a franchise distributor? You can compare those prices, and I have had a couple of those observations even in the test phases of SiliconExpert when I'm guiding future customers through SiliconExpert and these comparisons, where we find potentials of saving $10,000 to $15,000 typically in the first week. It just needs one case. Again, the amount of money saved from such cases also depends on the amount of components bought or sold or produced throughout a year. But overall, the entry ticket to understanding, is there a generally cheaper component out there from another manufacturer, requires safe and sound technical comparison of the components. And then, after they have been identified, go to the procurement side and see if prices can be compared. The short answer is
very good.
Yes, you can save money.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good examples. So let's jump to this next question. What methodologies do you use in order to calculate savings that obsolescence makes for a business? You kind of touched on it previously, but let's dive into that a little bit more.
If it's just for the obsolescence, I'll be quick, Bjoern. Normally, I don't. I show which data is there, and I'm trying to learn on how savings are being calculated towards the decision makers at the according companies or customers. And I just feed input into those formulas. The one who is the expert on guiding such formulas, that would be Bjoern.
That's actually, choose the right formula. And I've seen so many companies doing it wrong. They usually, especially if it comes to, for example, last time buy decisions or stocking information, they usually go down to the piece part price of a component or something and compare it with engineering effort. But that's not the right importance, because you would have eventually used the part anyhow. So pricing of the item is not really relevant. So if you want to use a correct methodology, and I mean, I could talk for the next 2 hours about it, so I will not go into too much detail about it. If you want to use the right methodology, it goes down to the formula. Correct formula would be the question in advance, again, what would possibly happen if an item in my system would eventually become obsolete? And it's not a matter of the piece part price of the component, because an item that only cost you a cent screws up your overall system, and you might be losing millions and millions of euros. So the right question is here, what happens if an item is becoming obsolete, and what type of item is it? Is it essential to my system? Is it security relevant? Is it an essential item? And if yes, how hard does it screw up my overall system? Being a maintainer, I might ask myself, okay, what happens if my machine fails? If I'm not capable of producing my end product anymore? If I'm obliged with a contract to produce a certain amount of products every month, every day, or whatsoever, what happens if I'm missing a simple capacitor or whatsoever? So how much money do I lose in sales in the end? So all these variables need to take into account to really build the correct formula about it. And I hope that wasn't a little bit of impulses to answer the question, because the formula is hard to determine. But if you're interested in more information, that might, I think, go beyond this 1 hour Q&A session. Maybe we can cover it in the next one.
Absolutely, for sure. All right, so let's do this next question. I know we were talking about money. So this next question, it is not necessarily a matter of money only. It's a matter of business continuity or even survival due to component obsolescence. Do you have market intelligence, ML tool, to predict obsolescence months or years ahead of time?
That might be a question for me, is it?
Yes, it is.
I think.
The short answer is yes. The little bit longer answer is We use an algorithm that's public and was developed by the Center of Advanced Lifecycle Engineering at the University of Maryland, I think back in 2008. And nicely, as it's now SiliconExpert using this algorithm and having it fine-tuned a bit so that we can forecast the year in which the obsolescence is going to happen with an accuracy and reliability of approximately 93%. Now we all know a co-author of this book where this algorithm has been published, and he's on this call as well. So thank you very much, Bjoern, for co-authoring this book.
Thanks, Oliver.
Excellent. All right, so moving on to the next question. This is very important. I know you are affiliated with Arrow, meaning SiliconExpert, but do you have a good grasp of the market outside Arrow? Microchip, onsemi, Vishay, Texas Instruments, etc.
I think this is yet another Oliver question for SiliconExpert, as we are a subsidiary of Arrow since 2012. And AMSYS is let's say, independent, but a loved partner. So are we agnostic or neutral or comprehensive to the world market? I think the kind of two questions, the answers would be yes and yes. So yes, we belong to Arrow. Yes, we are completely agnostic to that. So we cover the whole world market. Depending on whom you ask at Arrow, the line card covers approximately 10 to 12 million components. In the SiliconExpert database, we have a bit more than 1 billion electronic components connected with data. We get this data from 15,000 different manufacturers. We do not classify by which distributor does currently have line card privileges from which manufacturer. We have this data or this information listed on the supplier profiles within our tools, yes. But at the end of the day, any portfolio of a given distributor nowadays, even if it is 20 million, would be less than 2% of market relevance compared to the 1 billion components that SiliconExpert is collecting. Business-wise, just imagine that the business relationship in between SiliconExpert and Arrow looks like that Arrow, as the investing and owning company of SiliconExperts, gets our profits at the end of the year. That's about the business relationship, because we intend to be a happily growing software and data company, and therefore it is also important for Arrow as the company that has invested that SiliconExpert stays as relevant to the market as possible. So it is imperial that we cover everything. Reference to a certain geography, to a certain line card, which is even the reason that we are spreading beyond electronics. So there are a couple of hardware mechanical parts that you can find in the SiliconExpert databases as well. So
very
short
good.
answer was yes and yes.
Yes.
The long answer is just heard. The medium answer is it's all good, we're neutral.
Excellent. All right, so this next question is, I'm a buyer in the U.S. As parts become obsolete and scarce in today's environment, should I direct my engineers to spec automotive parts or avoid automotive parts? It is my understanding parts are going obsolete because manufacturers want to cater to the automotive industry. Very specific.
That's an interesting question. I mean, as I look at Oliver's face, maybe I can just start off and you will continue later on. I mean, since my early days or professional days in business, I have seen components become an obsolete from being an automotive spec, being a military spec, I mean, every types of component, not only electronic components, it's mechanical parts, it's fluids, it's even specs and standards and knowledge that can become obsolete. So at least from my end, not being a component engineer, this question is kind of hard to answer. If there's always choose automotive parts or never choose automotive parts answer to that questions, because in the verge of failure, let's get that straight. Everything will become obsolete at a certain point in time. So my answer would be, you better manage that problem. Be in a proactive or only reactive. We're given a lot of seminars and even certify obsolescence managers together with the International Institute of Obsolescence Management. And they usually ask the questions in my courses, so what can not become obsolete? One of my last courses, someone said wood. Yeah, it comes down to the spec. If you're required a certain teak, wood, or whatsoever, maybe it will become obsolete eventually as well. So everything can become obsolete, being it an automotive part or not. I think the more correct question would be, do automotive parts last longer than other industry components? And now I hand over to you, Oliver, because besides we're the process specialists, you're the data guy.
Okay. So the data guy would like to say, I don't like generalization. So if the question is, should I in general prefer automotive parts over others if I can? I always prefer to say no, or I don't know. The alternative question would be, shouldn't I prefer military parts? Because they were sometimes even longer, and also they went through highly specialized selection criteria quality-wise. But I understand where the question is coming from. The question is that I have to extend this is it an automotive component? Is it something which is AEC qualified? Or is it even declared as automotive component, has an AEC qualification, and it has a PPAP document attached to it? So there is something which is a bit more or a bit less real automotive component. And therefore, I would like to answer that question on a case by case based on data about the crosses that are available to each component in the SiliconExpert database. Based on that, I can give you a good advice. But for now, I do understand that if something got an AEC qualification, we will assume that it will stay for use and repair in cars for at least 10 years. And that gives us a bit more confidence in this component than in the non-automotive declared components that might be form fit function compatible of the same manufacturer. So I agree that confidence is something that you can get from automotive classifications, going to imply that this one will live longer than the industrial grade. I don't know. We have to look at the components separately. Which you database?
Very good,
Oliver. Just one more. Maybe I can ask you a question or something like that, because now we're moving from proactive approaches, reactive case management, and so on, more to the strategic side on obsolescence management. That goes to what components should I design in or whatsoever. I kind of feel that a general answer is not possible here, and just give the typical consulting answer, it depends, because there's more variables that should be taken into account once it comes to a proper and obsolescence-proof design, maybe even like what type of component is it? Is it a capacitor? Is it a RAM? Is it an IC or whatsoever? What type of manufacturer is it from? Do I have alternatives already qualified in my design? How long do I actually want to use this item in my design? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Can I actually stock the component? Yes or no? So is it stockable? And many, many more questions that then usually should be taken into account once it comes to design guidelines that basically every company that does full-scale obsolescence management will eventually come up with at a certain point in time. Do you agree on that?
I would, yes, of course. Because confidence is a feeling and the decision is something that we are all going to do based on data. So it's a difference. Correct. And process is going to give us peace of mind after we did the right things, and controlling those in a repetitive manner requires management, help of software, something that's designed and flows into the right direction.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So here's another question, a bit specific. When is a good trigger to design in a replacement for an NR&D component on a BOM? We see components can be in NR&D for years.
If I would define a trigger, go away from just looking at a piece part level of items. So if I would answer the question, the trigger is not only reliant on the piece part level. It depends on in how many configurations do you actually use the item, either in R&D or are not recommended for new design phase, or maybe even with a low forecast to become obsolete soon in 1 or 2 years. Go away from the thoughts only looking at each and every piece part, because it depends on where is this item built in my system. So I have to look up a little my configuration and then look down again. Are there other items in my configuration that are as well in NR&D? What are their forecasts? Are there maybe even obsolete items in my system? Because you don't want to waste engineering resources on designing out one single component out of your overall configuration. What you really want to do is dedicate the resources to design out already obsolete components that have not a good forecast, so that they might be on high risk, and even these R&D components at a certain point in time in future. That might mean to you that when a component jumps from being completely active and so on to NR&D, that you might want to stock up a little on this specific component. But to answer the question, to trigger the design, go away from this piece part view and really look at your overall configuration with all the data you need on each and every item that is built into different systems and so on. Combine all this data and transform data to information and then to good decisions in the end.
Excellent. Oliver, did you have anything to add to that?
I have just one more step or level to change the perspective a little. If something NR&D, for it doesn't matter how long, probably we would like to fix this problem. The question is when. So if you have no second source, means you don't have an improved second source in your ERP system at this moment, then you probably want to fix this now, or you would have fixed this 3 years ago. If you do have a second source for the according item, then you just flip the priorities and you just can continue producing. And you are now, now I no longer have peace of mind. When I am receiving the PCN for the second source, as long as I don't have a third source, then I will have to react quickly. This is when the wrong process kicks in. But if you have been strategically preparing your complete master parts list, that means for every item, I have a primary and a secondary source, meaning you have an implemented second source strategy with a 2-to-1 ratio. 2 manufacturers MPNs approved for each item or customer part number. Then you have peace of mind, can lean back when a PCA is coming in-house. But if it is an approved single source, you have to qualify a new one. If it is a technical single source where not even SiliconExpert knows a technically similar component in any other manufacturer, you maybe also are not going to choose to design a new component now. You will vote for last time buy, as this might be cheaper than having to fully redesign the complete product and not just one item. But at the end of the day, you have peace of mind if you had qualified second source alternatives for being long enough with years to end of life, being technical multi-sources by the known alternatives in our database, if they are environmentally compliant, as it's like with REACH and ROSE and so on, and it would be nice if they have a good history on being available and stable in price. and the distributors. But overall,
Excellent.
it's a yes to what Bjoern has said, and apply this to master parts level as well, and you gain peace of mind.
Great. All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit here to a panic situation. This question: we are observing life cycle changes to last time buy and even obsolescence without advanced notification from various manufacturers. What is the best course for a company when they have limited time to react in this type of change?
That's a good question. I would answer, be proactive, because if you would have been proactive, and I'm just making up the case now, and your item is just jumping from being completely active and so on to just be crossed out of the price books, you would have known in advance that this might be a high-risk item, not because of the likelihood that the item might become obsolete at a certain point in time, but because, and I'm sure this only gives you a headache, if this is an item that you cannot easily replace. So, and now I'm going to the impact section of an overall risk analysis. What you should do in advance, identify the items that are either built into every design of yours. Identify the items where your software is running on that you cannot easily replace. Identify the items where you have requalification requirements that you cannot easily exchange, and so on, because they might come up being high-risk components without even being obsoleted today, or being at high risk from the likelihood side. And if you do this in advance, you would have known. So I just encourage everyone here and all the attendees really move from the pure reactive side with all the headache to the proactive insurance side in obsolescence management. Because in the end, if you did not identify these items way before and bought yourself some time with being proactive, maybe even having the perfect solution already on hand and just apply it afterwards, you will never, ever cure that headache that will happen when a PDN or PCN drops in and you're just in the firefighting method.
I think this was probably one of the most important questions to have today. Like, I have obsolete components and I don't even have time for reactive obsolescence management. This implies that I didn't even do proactive obsolescence management. With all the worries that I would have for such a business, I think it's not just to have the data to make better decisions. You need to have a process adjusted. And when it comes to readjusting the internal processes to, at least in the future, being capable of avoiding these problems, besides having to fix it now, ask Bjoern. That's a process question. At the time for reactive obsolescence management, that's even a process question and not just a data question.
Good answer. Very nice. So, all right. So here's something that I believe really fluctuates based on the market and demands. But one question was, what components typically cause the most trouble for customers to replace? Example, processors, RAM, flash, etc. And I mean, we really are seeing that right now in the automotive industry as they ramp up production. There are certain shortages that occur, but historically, what have you guys seen as very problematic?
My answer would rhyme on YMCA, and it's basically AMCU. That means A components on an ABC analysis, the most costly ones, specifically those that are single source by nature. That means the expensive microcontrolling units. That's where the headache normally is biggest. If you try to replace them, knowing that they are designed by the manufacturers to be single source. You are not going to replace an Intel processor with an AMD on the very same, let's say, coding. And that's what I see when being asked in early presentations of SiliconExpert. Can you solve an obsolescence problem for this component that I have a big problem with? And there is a 50-50 chance that this question is going to be followed by a part number that is by design single source from the manufacturer. They know for the more expensive components that there is either a hole in competitors' portfolio or it's something which is unique to the market overall. And there is the hope that technical single sources are going to be addressed by companies or manufacturers, competitors, but very often they aren't. They stay single source, they stay unreplaceable, and in case of an obsolescence declaration, we hope that the manufacturer is going to provide a supplier recommended alternative, which is hopefully going to be a form fit function. But talking about form fit function alternative from the same manufacturer is probably a different question.
Oliver, I disagree with one point you just made, to be honest. You said it can be the expensive components, and I disagree on that one. It can be really, really cheap components that might be really hard to replace. So I agree with all the other points you just made, but would like to add, it can be the components that are the most expensive to replace in terms of engineering effort and so on, and not only on the component level, but what else do I need to change in my design, to then make a combination out of that. I hope you're with me on that one. It can be expensive component, but not necessarily.
I was expecting you to say, Oliver, this is risk management, and risk management is the impact caused by your side, Oliver, but you have to multiply this with probability unknown, and then you have the impact. That's risk management, Oliver, so it's not just the cost. You're right. That was the limitation of what's the probability of something getting obsolete, and wondering, oh, this processor really is a single source? I hadn't guessed that. The probability of that should be pretty low. No, we know upfront that this is expensive, but not of being replaceable by anything else. And I learned that management is impact by probability from you, Bjoern.
I mean, Oliver, it's so great that we can finally present one of our at least weekly talks that we have on discussions on how to manage obsolescence, how to get data integrations and all this, how to automate, and as you usually would say, to define world domination and obsolescence management, and have these types of discussions in front of our attendees here. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So far, I haven't built a country, but I do anticipate that everyone having plans to achieve world domination, they have good data in place and they have a process in place, like SiliconExpert and AMSYS.
This
Very
is
nice.
Why we are the perfect combination to another.
Well, you know, it's interesting. What an interesting way to wrap up the webinar. We're reaching the end of the hour, so I think that was our final question. We have a bunch more. We may actually have to do a part 2 to this Q&A if people are agreeable to it. We may have to do one in another month or two. We might have to do a part 2 Q&A with Bjoern and Oliver, which would be fantastic. But any final words that you guys want to add to this, and then I'll do a wrap up.
I will be totally in for second version. That's for sure. Actually, it was heaps of fun. It was for me, it was the first time in a live Q&A session as well. Oliver and I, we usually have these conversations and discussions in a more private area. But it is great. I'm looking forward to the second part then. I would say cooperation with SiliconExpert data and AMSYS lifecycle management processes will continue. And I'm thankful that we had so many attendees today, and want to thank you, George, for your moderation from my end.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Any last words, Oliver?
I completely second what Bjoern has just said. It's a good mix of what we do together with data and process. I'm glad that these questions have been submitted. Apparently, you could tell that I enjoyed answering them and also learning more from Bjoern while doing so. And yeah, can't wait to have our Q&A. Give it 1 or 2 months, I'm in it. And thanks again, George, for moderating this.
My pleasure. So very good. All right. So to the audience, for more information related to today's webinar, please visit the resource link available in the green folder icon at the bottom of your screen. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. And again, in the resource tab, there is the link to our previous webinar that actually had demos and an overview of the AMSYS SiliconExpert relationship and, you know, the integration. So that, I think that would be interesting for those of you who have not seen that yet. So thank you all for attending today's webinar, a Q&A session on obsolescence case management, brought to you by AMSYS and SiliconExpert. This webinar is copyright 2021 by SiliconExpert. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by SiliconExpert and AMSYS, and the speakers are solely responsible for their content and opinions. On behalf of our guests, Bjoern, Oliver, AMSYS, SiliconExpert, I'm George Corralius. Thank you and have a great day.